Thank you, everyone. It's great to see you. And I'm very honored to have Dr. Laffer here today with us at the World Knowledge Forum. While few economists are well known to the general public, but Dr. Laffer is certainly one of them. And his work has had a profound impact on economic policies in the US, UK, Chile, Argentina, and recently Ecuador, and many other countries. So given his extensive background of policymaking and involvement, I will ask a couple of questions that could interest you as an audience from South Korea. So let me start with the first question. Vice President Kamala Harris has proposed eliminating federal taxes on tips. However, her overall approach quite different significantly as she aims to prevent price gouging on necessary goods like drugs and groceries, introduce new taxes on unrealized capital gains, and raise corporate taxes. What economic effects might we expect from these policies if it's implemented?
Yeah, let me just say that, I don't know Kamala Harris very well. I've obviously followed her career, and I listened to the words she has said, and I've also watched what that administration, the Biden-Harris administration, has done. So I base my views on those, but I have no inside scoop on the Democratic Party.
Sure.
Duh, excuse me. But when you look at this, when you tax something, it makes it less attractive, and people do less of it. When you subsidize something, it makes the activity more attractive, and people do more of it. Economics is all about incentives. Governments can, through their policies, change the attractiveness of activities. By taxing something, you make it less attractive. By subsidizing something, you make it more attractive. What Kamala Harris has promised and what the Biden administration has delivered is they have raised taxes dramatically in the United States, and economic growth has slowed. They have taxed output, employment, and production, and that has lowered output, employment, and production. They have subsidized non-work, leisure, and unemployment. They've raised unemployment benefits. They've given huge stimulus package money out, which has caused. If you tax people who work and you pay people who don't work, do not be surprised if you find a lot less people working. I hope I'm not going way over your heads. This is economics. My view is that taxing unrealized capital gains, that raising the highest marginal income tax rate, increasing the corporate tax rate, which she has promised to do, all of these things I think would slow the economy down, would move us in the wrong direction. The North Star of taxation, the goal of all tax, is to have the lowest possible tax rate on the broadest possible tax base. So you provide people with the least incentives to evade, avoid, or otherwise not report taxable income, and you have the broadest base, so you provide them with the least places where they can put their income in order to avoid paying taxes. That is the North Star. My view is that this administration, the Biden-Harris administration, has moved us in the wrong direction, and that Kamala Harris, as candidate for president, and we don't know what she really will do, but as candidate, has proposed raising taxes across the United States quite dramatically and will move us away from the North Star. As I think we'll get to a little later, President Trump moved in the exact opposite direction. We cut the corporate tax rate dramatically. We cut the personal income tax rate dramatically. Donald Trump has, throughout we cut the death tax, the inheritance tax dramatically during him. The results were beautiful. I think Trump is going to be the big tax cutter to move us towards that North Star, and I think the Harris administration would move us further away from that North Star. In terms of economics, you cannot tax an economy into prosperity, nor can a poor person spend a country into wealth. You just can't do it. It's bad economics.
Thank you. So here in Korea, there are growing concerns about increasing inequality and reduced social mobility. And because of these concerns, many start to believe that higher taxes on the rich might be a solution. And there have been a lot of political disputes and conflicts that has been going on for many years here in Korea. So given your observations in the US, do you think these lessons learned from the US history or US experience are applicable to other countries, including South Korea?
Yeah. Let me just say, I do think they're very applicable. We're all human beings. We all respond to incentives. And even socialists respond to incentives. Capitalists respond to incentives. Tall people respond to incentives. We short people respond. All of us respond to incentives. When you look at the distribution of income, and this is what people are talking about with inequality, I think the debate is put in a very bad light and very improperly described. Equality is not a goal per se, and it should never be. Imagine you have a lot of poor people and a few rich people. Is the dream to make the rich people poor? No. The dream is to make the poor people rich. You know, there are two ways of achieving equality. One is to pull the rich down, and the other one is to push the poor up. Very different sets of policies and very different implications, and those economists who talk to you about equality without making the distinction are just plain misleading, and they're wrong, and they're doing a lot of damage in their discussions because they really are saying we need to attack the rich rather than help the poor. And that is not the right way to go. There is nothing wrong with being rich. There really isn't. There is something very wrong with being poor. It's poverty, and poverty is awful. The dream in this world for all of us is to make the poor richer, not to make the rich poorer. And when you look at this view, and I just finished a book, I've done it with Dr. Gene Sinkfield and Dr. Brian Dimitrovic as well, and what we look at is the entire history of the U.S. income tax from 1913 to the present. The whole history. We have access to every single U.S. tax return, every single one. We know what the tax return is, the last tax return in the top 1%. We know what the highest first tax return is in the bottom 99%. We have all of the data. And when you look at these things, please, people, please remember, no one cares about your opinion. No one gives a darn about your opinion. This is about facts, not how you feel. No, this is about facts. What happens when you raise the highest tax rate on the top 1% of income earners? That's what we had started off the income tax in 1913 with the highest rate 7%, and we're only less than half of 1% of the people were required to file an income tax return. Within 5 years, that tax rate had gone from 7% to 77%. In 1918, it was 77%. Then it went on down to 25%. It's gone all over the place in the U.S. We have massive amounts of variation in what has happened to the highest tax rates in the U.S. Sometimes they go way up, sometimes they come way down. When Reagan came in, we dropped them. In 1944, the highest tax rate in the United States was 94%. When Reagan left office, the highest tax rate was 28%. We've had all of this. We know what happens. And this is about facts again. And you've got to think in terms of facts, not what you hope is true, not what someone tells you is true. It's what is true. And when you look at this, whenever we've raised tax rates on the rich, every single time, the economy has underperformed. Every single time we have raised tax rates on the rich, every single time. Tax revenues from the rich have come down, not gone up. The tax rich shelter their income. They hire lawyers. They hire accountants. They hire deferred income specialists. They pay off politicians. In every country they do the same thing. And they shelter their income, and so their tax revenues go down whenever you... And lastly, every time we've raised tax rates on the rich, the biggest damage has been done to the poor, the minorities, the disenfranchised. Symmetrically, every time in the U.S. we've lowered tax rates on the top 1% of income earners, every time the economy has outperformed, every time tax revenues from the rich have gone up, not down. And every time the poor have prospered relatively by getting jobs, getting high-paid jobs, all of this there. Look at the facts, please. If you want to help the poor, if you want to help the disenfranchised, if you want to help those in lower circumstances, what you want to do is lower tax rates on the rich to bring in the jobs, output, employment, and production. What you want to do is you want to move to a low-rate, broad-based, flat tax which provides the proper incentives to create economic prosperity, jobs, output, employment, and tax revenue. Rich people fully understand they have to pay taxes. They just don't want you to steal their money. And they are just like everyone else. If the tax structure is fair, they'll pay their taxes fair and square. If you try to get 94% of all of their income, they'll do all they can to avoid paying taxes. They are just like us.
And now I would like to focus on the U.S. economy, given that we have discussed a lot of the policy issues. And recently, the U.S. has shown very robust economic growth with a low unemployment rate, strong household consumption, and solid performance from firms, especially in the IT sector. In contrast, most developed countries are experiencing much weaker economic performance. Do you think it's something to do with the tax/incentive systems? And if so, could you elaborate what makes the U.S. system this strong?
Yeah, well, let me just say that the recent recovery of the U.S. Came on the heels of the pandemic, the COVID-19, where we saw a huge drop. Now, there has been a rebounding back in the U.S. economy, which everyone argues is a robust economy. Let me just say that the robustness is not because it's a rebound coming from that. We have still not gotten up to the trend line that we had prior to the COVID-19. We're still many, many jobs short. What happened during the COVID-19 period, and I don't want to blame anyone for it, but they thought that the solution to COVID-19 was to spend lots and lots of money and give it to people. You know, if any of you know your economics, and this is where, you know, good economics it should be the central driving force for good public policy. And it has to be driven by good economics. When you give people money, not for working, but just give them money, they now have the ability to do what they want to do without working. And so what happened is a huge number of people in the U.S. left the labor force. Mm-hmm. They left the labor force, which meant that the unemployment rate came way down, which it did. Mm-hmm. And not only did the unemployment rate came way down, but also the employment rate also came way, way down. It's not that we had a very strong economy. We didn't. What we did was we paid people not to work, and all of them left the labor force. They are coming back into the labor force slowly, but my suggestion to President Trump and to others, anyone who will listen to me, my suggestion is that we should have a temporary federal payroll tax waiver of 50% for 18 months. In other words, what we would do is we would reduce the payroll tax on employees by 50%, and we'd reduce the payroll tax on employers by 50%. What that would do is that would increase real wages to workers by 3%, which would make them much more excited to work. It would reduce the cost to employers by 3%, which would make them much more anxious to employ. And also, because it's temporary, it's only 18 months, if you don't do it now, you're not going to get it. So it would accelerate economic growth through incentive structures to bring back all those people who've left the labor force and come back in. You know, that is the suggestion I think you should do, to bring back the U.S. to being a dynamic economic growth system, make it really worthwhile to work, and make it really worthwhile to employ workers, and make it temporary, so if you don't do it now, it's not going to happen. And I think that's the type of policy that would accelerate and jumpstart the U.S. economy and bring us back into the leadership of economic growth in this planet. And like Jack Kennedy, like Ronald Reagan, like Harding and Coolidge, we would be the dynamic nation. When we had our tax cuts under Reagan, from January 1st, 1983, people, January 1st, when the tax cuts took effect, to June 30th, 1984, that's 18 months. That's a year and a half. That's 6 quarters. U.S. real GDP growth from January 1st, 1983 to June 30th, 1984 was in real terms 12%. Grew at a compound annual rate for a year and a half at 8% per annum. That's China. That's what we need in the U.S. to bring us back to be the world leaders, to provide growth and opportunities for the poor, the minorities, the disenfranchised, produce the goods and services that can be so helpful to this world. Sorry, I get excited because this is what economics is all about. Economics is not to get even with people you don't like. Economics is to create prosperity and to eliminate poverty. That's what it's all about. Let's do it. Let's not hate the rich. Let's create prosperity for all.
So your suggestion that you mentioned about the temporary payroll tax cut, how do you compare that particular proposal relative to the former President Donald J. Trump introduced this Tax Cuts and Jobs Act of 2017?
Yeah. Let me just tell you, I was very involved in the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act of 2017, which was passed in December by one vote, the closest vote of all. And by the way, it was very hard getting that one vote. It was not easy. A lot of people, I don't know if you've ever heard this before, but there are a lot of people who do not like Donald Trump personally. I know that's a shock to all of you. He's such a lovable character, just joking. But he is. But the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, I'll focus on 3 things. Number 1, we cut the corporate tax rate from 35 to 21%. At 35%, we had the highest corporate tax rate of the OECD. Even when we lowered it to 21%, we still were in the top 1/3 of the OECD countries in highest rates. And just for economics reasons, if you have 2 countries, A and B, and if you raise the corporate tax rate in B and lower it in A, producers and manufacturers and people in factories and jobs are going to move from B to A. Am I going way over your heads on this? Please help me on this. We lowered the corporate tax rate from 35 to 21%. We dropped the personal income tax rate from 39.6% to 37%. We did a lot of other little things. 100% expensing of capital purchases, we did that. But we also reduced the death tax in America dramatically by increasing exemptions. And what happened to the economy? From December of 2017, I'll go from the 4th quarter of 2017 through the 3rd quarter of 2019, for that 2-year period. U.S. real GDP growth had been going right along with Eurozone, had been moving right with it quarter by quarter, just moving, boom, boom, bam. At that point, the day that tax bill passed, U.S. growth rates relative to Eurozone increased dramatically. By the end of the 2-year period, U.S. GDP was 2.5% higher than it would have been had it grown at the same rate of the Eurozone. Number 1. Poverty. Poverty amongst the poor, the minority, the disenfranchised. U.S. poverty rates dropped dramatically to the lowest ever. By the way, they had been coming down before. So under the Obama administration, they had been coming down, but they continued to go down under Trump. Black unemployment rates in the United States continued to go down to the lowest levels ever recorded in history. Hispanic unemployment rates, they had been coming down before Trump, but they continued to go down to the lowest levels ever. Those people who did not graduate from high school, their unemployment rates dropped as well. Now, they had been coming down under Obama. It wasn't though Obama wasn't doing it, but they continued to go down to the lowest levels ever. Now let's get to the cruncher. Tax revenues. Federal tax revenues. From the 4th quarter of 2017 through the 3rd quarter of 2019, in that 2-year period, real tax revenue were substantially higher than they had been in the prior 2-year period. And not only were they substantially higher than the prior 2-year period, but they were higher than the prior 2-year period by more than the prior 2-year period had been hired to the previous 2-year period before that. In other words, tax revenues in the tax cuts paid for themselves 100% in the first 2 years. Now, obviously, the corporate tax revenues shrank dramatically, duh. Of course, that's where we cut the tax rate. But all the other federal tax receipts increased by enough more to offset the corporate tax revenue reductions. Today, corporate tax revenues are much, much higher than they had been prior to the corporate tax rate reduction. The Tax Cuts and Jobs Act paid for itself in full, period. And yet you hear all of these economists say how it led to these huge deficits. You hear these politicians. That is acres and acres of soap suds and horse manure. It is just factually not true. The Tax Cuts and Jobs Act was one of the best job creators, one of the best inequality improvers, and one of the best jobs of tax revenue growth, not reduction.
All right, thank you. So as we near the end of our discussion, I would like to ask one final question about the role of politicians and policymakers. And throughout your answers, you've emphasized the importance of incentive systems. In democratic countries like US and South Korea, these systems are shaped by laws and policies, which rely on capable and accountable politicians and policymakers. How can we ensure that they act in the best interest of the general public and work toward their long-term prosperity?
Dr. Lee, thank you. When you look at it, the policy should be, and it's a Latin phrase that every doctor knows, is primum non nocere. First of all, do no harm. Don't experiment on the real world and on the economy. If you see things going wrong, the Latin phrase should be vis medicatrix naturae, which means the healing power of nature. When we had bad economy in 1987 with Reagan, President Reagan's phrase was, don't just stand there, undo something. Get government out of the way. Don't put more government in. The nature has handled itself beautifully. Be very, very careful when you implement policies that you will have a massive amount of unintended consequences, because you do. Almost all of the great recessions, almost all of the poverty in this world has been caused by government, not in spite of government. And my solution here is not that you shouldn't use government. You should. We need government. We need it very badly, but it should be proportional. We need the justice system. We need highways. We need defense. We need education. We need all of these. But what you do is you don't want to go beyond the specific purposes at hand. What you want to do is look at when the damage done by the last dollar of taxes collected is a little bit less than the benefit done by the last dollar of government spending, you stop already. That's the optimal size of government. If you spend more than that, you're going to hurt the economy. If you spend less than that, you're going to hurt the economy. You want the right size of government. Now, how do you get that right size? By making sure you use all of your economic knowledge and skills to make sure that you're spending the money in the single best possible way for the benefit of the people. Not to pay off your friends, not to do ideological things there. No, you do it to help the country. And when the benefit from the last dollar of spending is a little bit more than the last dollar of damage done by taxes, you stop and you redo. Now, how do you get politicians to do that? It's pretty hard. I have never heard of a politician who died poor. I don't know. I'm sure that's not true in Korea, but in America, almost all of our politicians very shortly become millionaires. How that happens, I don't know. They're going to become rich. That's what being a politician is. Everyone likes being rich, and politicians have all of the tools available to them to become rich. What we need to do with politicians is make it that when they become rich, they also make us rich. I don't mind politicians becoming rich as long as they make our country become rich. So my view about politicians, and forgive me about this, but my view of politicians is we should put all politicians on commission. If the economy grows at 3%, they get their pay fair and square. If the economy grows at 4%, we'll double their pay. If the economy grows at 5%, we'll triple their pay. If the economy grows at 2%, sorry, no pay whatsoever. And if the economy grows at 1%, they owe us the money they would have received in pay if the economy had grown at 3%. You want to make sure that politicians get rewarded in an incentive-based system just like everything else. We tax people who speed on the freeway to get them to stop speeding. We tax smokers to get them to stop smoking. Why then do we tax people who earn income? Why then do we tax people who employ other people? Why then do we tax companies who make wonderful products at low cost for their products? We don't do it to get them to stop producing. We do it to do revenues. But what I want you to realize in the last seconds here is the same consequences happen to employees, happen to earning income and jobs as happens to speeders, smokers, and drinkers. Thank you very much for being here today. I love being in Korea, and I love your country. And if ever I can do anything, you just ask this young lady over here, and I will send her in first, and then I'll come over and visit you. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Laffer, for sharing your valuable insights with us today. We gained a deeper understanding of the U.S. situation. We appreciate your time and expertise. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Lee. This is the most wonderful person ever, Dr. Lee.